The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet little town, painting the streets with soft golden light. Inside a cozy diner on Main Street, the familiar sound of clinking dishes and murmured conversations filled the air. Henry, a 93-year-old World War II veteran, sat in his usual corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, and a peaceful smile played on his lips. Henry was a man of routine. Every morning, he walked the short distance from his house to the diner, where he'd sit and enjoy the warm, comforting atmosphere. Everyone in the town knew Henry. His sharp memory and quick wit often left people amazed. Despite his age, he carried himself with a quiet strength that hinted at the extraordinary life he had lived. As he sipped his coffee, Henry gazed out of the window, watching the town wake up. A group of children ran past, laughing and chasing each other. It reminded him of his own youth, a time when life was simpler but not without challenges. He had fought in battles far from home, seen things no young man should ever see, and yet he had returned with a heart full of hope and gratitude. The peaceful morning, however, was about to take an unexpected turn. The sound of roaring motorcycles broke the calm as a group of bikers pulled into the diner's parking lot. Their bikes gleamed in the sunlight, loud and intimidating. A few of the patrons exchanged uneasy glances as the men entered, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. Henry looked up briefly, then returned to his coffee. He wasn't one to judge anyone by their appearance, but the air shifted as the bikers made their way to the counter. They were loud, laughing boisterously, and their conversations were peppered with crude jokes that made the other customers uncomfortable. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scruffy beard, glanced around the room and noticed Henry sitting alone. Something about the older man's calm demeanor seemed to irritate him. "Hey, old-timer," he called out, smirking as his friends chuckled. "This place served prune juice, or you just here for the early bird special?" The diner fell silent. All eyes turned to Henry, who slowly set down his coffee. He looked up, his blue eyes meeting the biker's gaze without a hint of fear. "Just enjoying my coffee," Henry said politely, his voice steady and calm. The biker laughed, nudging his friends. "Coffee, huh? Don't spill it now. Wouldn't want to ruin your cardigan." A couple of the diner staff whispered nervously, unsure of how to handle the situation. But Henry didn't flinch. He had faced far worse in his life, and he wasn't about to let a few rude remarks ruin his morning. He simply returned his attention to his coffee, his quiet dignity making the biker's mockery seem small and insignificant. But the leader wasn't done. As his laughter grew louder, the tension in the diner thickened, setting the stage for what would become a morning no one would forget. Henry sipped his coffee, choosing to stay calm despite the biker's rude remarks. He had learned long ago that reacting to provocations often made things worse. But the leader of the bikers wasn't satisfied with being ignored. He stepped closer to Henry's table, his boots making a heavy thud with each step. "Hey, old man," the biker said, leaning on the edge of the table with a grin. "You're pretty quiet. Cat got your tongue." His friends laughed behind him, enjoying the show. Henry raised his eyes, his gaze steady but kind. "Just having my coffee, son. No need to disturb yourself." His voice was calm, almost fatherly, and it caught the biker off guard. For a moment, the leader didn't know how to respond, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Disturb myself," the biker repeated, his grin turning into a smirk. "You're the one disturbing my morning, sitting here all smug like you own the place." The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked to the diner staff for help, but the waitresses seemed too scared to intervene. The bikers were intimidating, and no one wanted to escalate the situation. Henry remained calm, but his patience was being tested. He had seen bravery and fear in his time, and he recognized fear in the faces around him. It saddened him to see how people allowed intimidation to silence them. "Son," Henry said after a pause, his voice steady, "if you have a problem, maybe we can talk about it. But ruining everyone else's breakfast isn't the way to go about it." The biker leader wasn't expecting such a composed response. His smirk faltered, but he quickly covered it with a louder laugh. "Talk about it," he mocked. "What are you, a therapist now? Or just an old war hero trying to sound wise?" One of the bikers nudged the leader. "Simon, man, he's just an old guy. Let it go." But the leader wasn't ready to let it go. His pride was on the line, and he wanted to prove he was in control. "Nah, this old-timer thinks he's smarter than me. Let's see how smart he is." He reached for Henry's coffee cup and tipped it over, spilling the hot liquid across the table. Gasps echoed through the diner as the other patrons watched in disbelief. Henry's expression didn't change. He calmly picked up a napkin and began dabbing at the spilled coffee. His silence spoke volumes, and it unnerved the leader. "What's the matter?" the biker taunted. "Cat got your coffee now." His friends laughed, but it was clear some of them were starting to feel uneasy. Henry straightened up, his movements deliberate. He looked at the leader with a calm but piercing gaze. "You must think this makes you look strong," he said softly. "But strength isn't about tearing others down. It's about lifting them up." The diner fell silent again. The biker leader opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Something in Henry's tone made even him hesitate. Though Henry's words were wise, the leader wasn't ready to back down. The situation was tense, and everyone in the diner held their breath, wondering what would happen next. The tension in the diner was thick as Henry sat calmly, his piercing gaze locked on the biker leader. For a moment, it seemed like the man might back down, but his pride wouldn't let him. The leader straightened up, crossing his arms with a defiant smirk. "You think you're better than me, don't you, old man?" he sneered, sitting there all high and mighty, like you've got something to prove. Henry didn't reply. Instead, he calmly wiped the coffee off his table with a napkin. The silence only seemed to enrage the biker leader more. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the leader shouted, slamming his fist on the table. The sound echoed through the diner, making a few customers jump in their seats. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that things were going too far. One of them, a younger man with a nervous expression, tugged on the leader's arm. "Simon, man, let's just eat and go. It's not worth it." But the leader shook him off, his focus still on Henry. "Not worth it. This guy thinks he's better than us. Somebody needs to teach him a lesson." He grabbed the corner of Henry's jacket, where a small medal was pinned. It was an old military medal, polished and shining, a symbol of the sacrifices Henry had made decades ago. "What's this?" the leader asked mockingly, tugging at the medal. "You think this little piece of metal makes you special? Makes you a hero?" The diner grew even quieter, if that was possible. The patrons were horrified, but no one dared to intervene. The staff stood frozen behind the counter, their faces pale with fear. Henry's hand shot out, gripping the leader's wrist with surprising strength for a man his age. His grip was firm, but his eyes remained calm. "That medal," he said in a quiet but commanding tone, "represents the lives of men who didn't make it home. Men who gave everything so people like you could live free." For a brief second, the leader hesitated. There was something in Henry's voice, something unshakable and powerful, but his pride quickly overpowered any sense of guilt. He yanked his arm free and took a step back. "Big words from an old man," the leader said, laughing nervously. "But words don't mean much when you can't back them up." Henry didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The bikers exchanged confused looks as he calmly dialed a number and put the phone to his ear. "What's he doing?" one of them whispered. The leader snorted, "Calling the cops. They won't get here in time, old man." Henry ignored him, speaking a few quiet words into the phone before hanging up. Then he looked back at the leader, his expression unchanged. "You've got about 5 minutes to rethink your choices," he said simply. The leader laughed, but it sounded forced. The other bikers shifted uneasily, sensing that something was about to happen. The rest of the diner waited in silence, unsure of what Henry had just set into motion. Outside, the faint rumble of distant engines began to grow louder. The sound was steady, deliberate, and unmistakable. It was the sound of motorcycles, but not the ones the bikers had arrived on. The bikers exchanged nervous glances as the noise grew closer. The leader tried to maintain his bravado, but his confidence wavered. Whatever was coming, it was clear that Henry wasn't afraid. And that was enough to make everyone else uneasy. The rumble of engines grew louder, filling the air outside the diner. The noise was steady and strong, not like the reckless roar of the bikers' motorcycles. Everyone in the diner, from the staff to the patrons, turned their heads toward the windows. The leader of the bikers frowned, his bravado slipping as he glanced at his friends. "What's going on out there?" he muttered, his voice lower now. Henry remained seated, his calm demeanor unshaken. He picked up a clean napkin and folded it neatly, placing it on the table as if he had all the time in the world. "You'll see," he said softly, his tone as steady as ever. Moments later, several motorcycles pulled into the diner's parking lot. These weren't flashy, loud bikes like the ones the bikers had ridden. They were sturdy and well-maintained, each one bearing small patches or emblems on the side. The riders dismounted one by one, their movements smooth and purposeful. The door to the diner swung open, and the leader of the new group stepped inside. He was a tall man with silver hair, his posture straight and commanding. He wore a leather jacket adorned with a few small insignias, military patches recognizable to those who knew their meaning. Behind him, more men and women entered, each one carrying an air of quiet strength. Their ages varied, but their eyes told the same story. They were veterans, like Henry. The leader of the bikers took a step back, his confidence faltering. "Who are these guys?" he asked, his voice not as loud as before. The silver-haired man scanned the diner, his sharp eyes landing on Henry. A smile broke across his face as he walked over, extending a hand. "Henry," he said warmly, gripping Henry's hand with respect. "Good to see you again, old friend." Henry smiled back, standing to meet his friend. "Good to see you too, Tom. Sorry to call you out so early, but I figured you'd want to know about this." He nodded slightly in the direction of the bikers. Tom's smile faded as he turned to the leader of the bikers. His gaze was steady and firm, and the room seemed to grow even quieter. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge that made it clear he expected an answer. The leader of the bikers swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. "We were just having a little fun," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. Tom stepped closer, his expression serious. "Fun, huh? Harassing a man who's given more to this country than you'll ever understand doesn't sound like fun to me." The other veterans stood silently behind Tom, their presence alone enough to make the bikers uneasy. The patrons in the diner watched in awe as the dynamic shifted. The leader of the bikers tried to laugh it off, but it sounded hollow. "Look, we didn't mean any harm," he said quickly, his eyes darting between Tom and Henry. Henry didn't say a word, letting his old friend handle the situation. Tom's gaze didn't waver as he replied, "You've got two choices: apologize and leave, or stay and face the consequences. But let me warn you, we don't take kindly to bullies." The leader of the bikers hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Outside, more veterans stood near their motorcycles, their presence a silent reminder of the strength and unity of those who had served. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence crumbling as they realized they were outmatched, not by numbers, but by the sheer resolve of the people they were facing. The atmosphere in the diner had changed completely, and there was no doubt about who held the upper hand now. The leader of the bikers stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely gone. He glanced nervously at his friends, but none of them seemed eager to step forward. The presence of the veterans, their calm confidence, was unlike anything the bikers had encountered before. Tom, the silver-haired leader of the veteran group, kept his gaze steady on the biker leader. His tone was calm, but carried an undeniable weight. "Well, what's it going to be? An apology, or are you looking for something else?" The biker leader tried to muster some of his old confidence, forcing a laugh that sounded weak and hollow. All right. No need to make this a big deal. We'll leave." But Tom didn't move, and neither did the veterans behind him. "Not so fast," he said, his voice firm. "There's a man here you owe more than just an exit. You owe him respect. And an apology." The diner was silent, all eyes on the bikers. The leader shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being called out in such a way. He turned to Henry, his smirk replaced by an awkward grimace. Look, old man, we didn't mean anything by it. Just joking around, you know." Henry met his eyes calmly, his expression unchanging. "A joke loses its humor when it's meant to hurt someone," he said simply. His words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. The leader's face turned red, but not from anger. He looked around, realizing there was no way out of this without swallowing his pride. "Fine," he muttered, looking down at the floor. "Sorry." Tom raised an eyebrow. "That's not how you apologize," he said firmly. "Look him in the eye and mean it." The biker leader glanced back at his friends, but they avoided his gaze. With no support behind him, he had no choice but to do as Tom said. He straightened up and looked at Henry, though his voice still lacked sincerity. "I'm sorry for disrespecting you. It won't happen again." Henry nodded slightly, but his expression made it clear he wasn't impressed by the forced apology. "It's not me you've disrespected," he said softly. "It's the sacrifices this medal represents. Remember that." The biker leader's face twitched, and for a moment, he seemed ready to argue. But the weight of the room, the quiet strength of the veterans, and the disapproving stares of the diner patrons kept him silent. Tom stepped forward again, his tone lighter now but still firm. "All right, you've said your piece. Now I suggest you and your friends head out before you embarrass yourselves any further." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They shuffled out of the diner, their heads low, and their earlier arrogance replaced by shame. The leader paused at the door, glancing back one last time, but the sight of the veterans standing united behind Henry made him quickly look away. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the diner lifted. The staff let out quiet sighs of relief, and a few patrons clapped softly, their respect for Henry and the veterans clear. Tom turned to Henry, a small smile on his face. "You all right, old friend?" Henry chuckled, finally letting some warmth back into his expression. "I'm fine, Tom. Thanks for showing up." Tom grinned. "Anytime. You know we got your back." The rest of the veterans nodded in agreement, their camaraderie a reminder of the bonds they had forged through years of service. Henry smiled, feeling grateful for the friends who had always stood by him when it mattered most. The diner slowly returned to its usual hum of conversation, the awkwardness from the confrontation beginning to fade. But the bikers' departure had left a lingering sense of unease among the patrons. The entire scene had unfolded in a way none of them had expected, and now they couldn't help but admire the strength Henry had shown. The veterans, standing tall and proud, started to relax. Tom walked over to Henry's table, his hands in his jacket pockets, his smile more genuine now. "Well, Henry, I've got to say, you handled that better than I ever could." Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "Just didn't have the energy to argue. I've learned that standing tall and quiet works better than any words could." The other veterans gathered around the table, all of them nodding in agreement. There was a certain quiet power in their presence, a strength built not from words, but from years of hard-earned experience. Just as they began to settle into easy conversation, the door to the diner opened again, and the biker leader reappeared. The once confident man now seemed smaller, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He stepped into the diner, and all eyes turned toward him. Henry raised an eyebrow, but he didn't say anything. The leader, however, had clearly come back with an intention to do more than just leave. His voice was quiet and full of regret as he approached Henry's table. "Look," the biker leader said, glancing around at the veterans who were watching him carefully. I didn't handle things right earlier. I was wrong. I was out of line. And I see that now. I didn't mean to disrespect you or anyone else." His words were slow, and they didn't come easily. It was clear that swallowing his pride was harder than he had anticipated. The other bikers stood outside the diner, waiting, clearly unsure of what had brought their leader back in. Henry didn't rush to answer. He simply looked at the man, his calm expression showing no sign of animosity. "It's never too late to do the right thing," Henry said softly. "But it's about more than just saying sorry. It's about showing respect in the way you live your life." The leader looked down at the floor, clearly uncomfortable. "Yeah, I get that now," he mumbled. "I've been an idiot. You don't deserve that kind of treatment, and neither do the others who served." The veterans exchanged glances, and Tom gave a small nod. He appreciated the effort, even if it didn't fix everything. "It takes a lot of courage to come back and admit you were wrong," Tom said. "Most people can't do that. It's a start, but don't expect anyone to just forget the way you acted." The biker leader nodded in agreement. "I know. I'll do better. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I'll make things right, starting with showing some respect to those who deserve it." With that, the leader turned and walked back out of the diner, his head held a little higher than before, though still weighed down by the consequences of his actions. He hadn't fully redeemed himself, but it was a step in the right direction. Henry and the veterans watched him leave, and the mood in the diner felt lighter, more relaxed. The patrons who had witnessed the exchange couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the way Henry had handled the situation. Tom looked at Henry with a smile. "I think that went well, all things considered." Henry nodded, a small smile on his face. "It did. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about showing him the value of respect." The veterans, one by one, sat back down and resumed their quiet conversations, while the rest of the diner went back to their morning routines. But something had changed in the air. There was a new understanding, a new respect for the strength of character and the power of standing tall, no matter the odds. As the bikers left the diner, the quiet hum of conversation gradually returned, but the atmosphere had shifted. The staff breathed a collective sigh of relief, and the regulars went back to their meals, though there was a sense of awe in the air. Henry, the quiet and steady figure they had known for years, had just been at the center of a tense situation, and handled it with grace. Tom and the veterans returned to their seats, and soon the conversation turned to lighter topics. The group began reminiscing about their past experiences, sharing old stories from their time in service. Henry listened, smiling softly as his old friends laughed together, but it wasn't long before someone in the diner, a curious young man sitting at the counter, spoke up. "You know," the young man said, glancing toward Henry, "I've always seen you here, sitting by yourself, but I never really knew who you were. You don't talk much. What's your story?" Henry looked up from his coffee, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He wasn't used to talking about himself, but there was something in the young man's voice that made him decide to share. "Well," Henry began, his voice slow and steady, "I was just like any other young man once. I grew up in a small town just trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. But then World War II came along, and everything changed. I was 18 when I enlisted, thought I'd be a hero, like you see in the movies. But the truth is, war isn't like the stories you hear. It's messy and brutal, and it changes you." The young man leaned forward, listening intently. Henry's voice was calm, but there was a weight in it that spoke of experience. "I fought in the Pacific, on islands you've probably never heard of. I didn't fight for glory or medals. I fought for my brothers in arms, the men beside me. And I came home, but a lot of them didn't." Tom, who had been sitting quietly, nodded in agreement. Henry's one of the few left from that generation. "A lot of us are gone, But we remember the sacrifices. We remember those we lost. The young man's eyes widened. I had no idea. You never talk about it. Henry chuckled softly, shaking his head. What's there to talk about? The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it back. They don't need me to tell their story. I'm just here, trying to live out the rest of my days in peace. But the young man wasn't satisfied. But you're still here. You've lived through so much. You've earned the right to share your story. Henry paused for a moment, his fingers gently tapping the side of his coffee cup. Maybe. But I don't want to be remembered for the medals or the wars. I want to be remembered for the life I led afterward. For the quiet moments, the people I helped, the friends I made. That's what matters more than any battle. The young man nodded, his face filled with respect. I get it now. It's not about the past. It's about how you live today. Henry smiled and gave a slight nod. Exactly. The past is behind us, but today is all we've got. That's why we should make the most of it. The conversation shifted as the patrons of the diner absorbed Henry's words. The weight of his experience, and the calm wisdom with which he shared it, left a lasting impact. Tom leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. You've always had a way with words, Henry. That's why we all respect you so much. Henry smiled, but his eyes grew distant for a moment, as though recalling memories long buried. Respect doesn't come from telling stories. It comes from living them. The diner grew quiet again, but this time it was a comfortable silence, one filled with respect and understanding. Henry had revealed a part of himself that no one had known before, and in doing so, he had earned a new level of admiration from those around him. They all understood now that Henry wasn't just a quiet old man sipping his coffee. He was a man who had lived through history and still carried its lessons with him. The morning at the diner carried on peacefully after Henry shared his story, and the usual bustle of daily life returned. The patrons, some of whom had been present during the altercation with the bikers, seemed to look at Henry with a new sense of respect. There was something different in the air now, a quiet understanding that this wasn't just a man sitting alone with his coffee. This was someone who had lived a life full of experience, sacrifice, and lessons learned. As the hours passed, the conversation in the diner shifted. The young man who had first asked Henry about his past continued to stay close, listening attentively as Henry and the veterans talked about the days they spent in service. They shared stories of camaraderie, of hardships overcome, and of the bonds that had been forged in the most difficult of circumstances. Life is a series of choices, Henry said, his voice soft but steady. Some big, some small. Some of them can change everything. The young man nodded, intrigued by Henry's words. What was the biggest choice you ever had to make? He asked. Henry paused for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. It was clear he was thinking about something deep, something important. The hardest choice, Henry began slowly, was leaving my brothers behind. Not because I wanted to, but because that's what war demanded. We had to keep moving, even when it felt like we were leaving part of ourselves behind. But it taught me something I've never forgotten. The young man leaned forward, eager to hear more. What's that? It taught me that no matter how hard things get, no matter how far we have to go, we keep going. For the ones who can't, for the ones who didn't make it, we live our lives for them, and we do it right. Tom, sitting nearby, smiled warmly. That's the kind of wisdom you can't learn from books or school. That comes from experience, from living through the hardest days and still finding a way to move forward. The young man seemed to be absorbing every word, his respect for Henry growing deeper with each story. It must have been hard, leaving them behind, he said quietly. Henry nodded. It was. But it's part of the deal. You fight for something bigger than yourself. And sometimes, you don't get to pick what happens, but you don't stop. You can't stop. The diner was quieter now, and the usual chatter had been replaced by a sense of reflection. Henry had reminded everyone that it's not always the big moments that define a person. It's the choices made along the way, the small actions that show character, and the ability to keep going when everything else seems to be falling apart. As the conversation wrapped up and the diner began to clear out, the young man stood up, walking over to Henry's table. "I just want to say, thank you," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I didn't really get it before, but now I do. You've taught me something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Henry looked up and smiled, his eyes warm. "You'll figure it out," he said. "Just remember that respect and strength aren't about making the loudest noise. Sometimes it's about standing tall, even when no one's watching." With that, the young man nodded, a new light in his eyes, and walked out of the diner, his steps purposeful. He would never forget the lessons Henry had shared. Tom watched the young man leave and turned back to Henry with a smile. "You've done it again, Henry. Made us all remember what really matters." Henry simply smiled, his heart full. He didn't need recognition or thanks. He had lived his life the way he thought was right, and that was enough. The lessons he had learned along the way had shaped him into the man he was, and he knew he had passed those lessons on to others. The diner was quiet now, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with respect, understanding, and a reminder that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful messages. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the diner as the day wound down. The usual evening crowd started trickling in, but there was a different energy in the air. People entered the diner a little quieter, a little more thoughtful. There was something about Henry's story that had left its mark on everyone who had been there that morning. Henry was still sitting at his table, sipping his coffee, as though nothing had changed. He had always been a man of routine, finding comfort in the small moments of life. But today the diner felt different to him. The respectful nods from the staff, the lingering glances from the regulars. It was clear that people now saw him in a new light. Tom had left earlier, but not before reminding Henry that he'd be back the next morning for their usual chat. Henry smiled and waved his friend off. For now, though, it was just him and his coffee, enjoying the quiet after a storm of emotions. Across the room, the young man who had asked Henry about his past sat with his friends. He kept glancing over at Henry, his mind racing with everything he had learned. The lessons Henry had shared weren't just about war or the past. They were about life itself, about respect, humility, and perseverance. The young man stood up, and his friends followed suit, making their way over to Henry's table. He cleared his throat, and Henry looked up, smiling kindly. "I just wanted to thank you again, Henry," the young man said, his voice sincere. "I've been thinking about what you said all day. It means more than I can explain." Henry's smile deepened, his eyes softening. "You don't have to thank me, son. The things I've said aren't new. They've been around for a long time. You just have to choose to listen." The young man nodded, his expression serious. "I will. I promise. You've taught me something I'll never forget." The group stood there for a moment, the weight of Henry's words lingering in the air. Then the young man turned, and with his friends, left the diner, his step purposeful, a new understanding of life guiding him forward. As the door swung shut, Henry returned to his coffee, content in the knowledge that he had made a difference. It wasn't about grand gestures or loud speeches. It was about a quiet, simple life, lived with integrity and respect for others. The evening continued to unfold, but Henry wasn't concerned with the time. He wasn't looking for any form of recognition or praise. He had already received what he needed, the peace that came from knowing he had shared his story and made a difference, even in the smallest of ways. A few more patrons came and went, but none seemed to notice Henry's absence of fame or his lack of desire for attention. They simply respected him, as one would respect a person who had lived a life full of meaning. As the diner emptied and the lights began to dim, Henry stood up, paid for his coffee, and made his way out the door. He took his time, walking slowly through the quiet streets of the town he had called home for so many years. It wasn't just the stories he had lived that made him a hero. It was the quiet, everyday choices, the small acts of kindness, the dignity in every action, the ability to stand tall even when the world tried to knock him down, that truly defined him. And as Henry walked through the peaceful streets, the town knew that it had a quiet hero among them, someone who had shown them the power of living with respect, strength, and honor.